Welcome back to the You Asked For It podcast at Plainfield Christian Church. This summer, we are taking some of your most requested questions and talking about them. Today, the question that we're going to look at is, how is Christianity different than other religions? My name is Riley Weaver. I'm one of the ministers here at the church, and I am here with the distinguished Jeff Acton.
Yeah. Hey, Riley, it's good to be back together again. For those that listened to the previous week, we got to talk about immigration, and now we're getting to talk about world religions.
Yeah. So tell us a little bit why you think you were invited to talk on this issue.
Yeah, I think I've spent some time studying world religions. I get to teach as an adjunct professor at a local university here in Indianapolis in the philosophy and religion department, which means that I occasionally will teach a world religion class. And so while I don't consider myself necessarily an expert, it is something that I find really intriguing and interesting and have spent some time studying.
Yeah, great.
What about you? Like, what do you think? Why do you think you're here, Riley?
Yeah, well, as we discussed on the podcast last week, I'm the missions minister here at the church, so I get to travel and visit other cultures, see other places, and interact with a lot of people from other religions. So I think, you're coming at it from maybe more of an academic side, and I'm coming at it from more of a practical side.
Yeah, that's fair.
So before we jump into the meat of the podcast, can you give us a definition of religion? We just want to make sure everybody is on the same page about what we're going to be talking about today.
Yeah, I think broadly speaking, a religion would be a set of organized beliefs that would have practices, you could maybe even say systems, that typically relate to the worship of a higher power or a deity. And typically, religion's going to offer guiding principles for life, for ethics, for spirituality. Most religions would offer this like a sense of purpose and community for people. And this like understanding of the nature of the universe, why we exist, what is our purpose, and all of that surrounding a focus on, again, like a deity or the supernatural or the sacred.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And, as we were talking and preparing for this, we agree that there are kind of four broad categories of religion.
Yeah, obviously we can't talk about all the religions, right? We can't dive into what everyone believes.
Exactly. Well, and like you said earlier, you're not an expert on this, and I would say I'm not either. So we can't dive into everything, but kind of the broad categories. The first would be the Abrahamic traditions. Those would be religions that have either spiritually or even physically descended from Abraham. Those would be Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. So, Jews, they would say that they have literally descended from Abraham. Right. Christians, we would say that we've spiritually descended from Abraham because of our, kind of birth out of Judaism. And then Islam as well, they would say they've descended from Abraham in kind of another way out of his family. So these religions, they share belief in one God. And they also share many prophets and sacred scriptures. Like Christians, Muslims, and Jews, we all believe in, the first 5 books of the Old Testament, the Torah. And there's also a strong emphasis on ethics, right and wrong in these religions, although I would say that there's kind of a focus on some of those things for different reasons.
For sure.
And, for this conversation, it's also important to mention that you often hear people say, well, Christianity is a relationship, not a religion. And I think that's true to an extent. But in this conversation, it is important to remember that Christianity is, by definition, also a religion. It just allows us to have a relationship with God. So what else would you add? What's another category, Jeff?
Another category we could look at would be what we call Indian religions, religions that were birthed from the subcontinent of India. And there would be a set of religions that would share some things in common. So that would be Hinduism, Buddhism, Sikhism, Jainism. Those would all kind of, they're different. There's a lot of variety in them, but they would hold some things in common. So they would believe in karma, right? Which karma just believes, this idea that our consequences have like impact on our future existence. Reincarnation, typically, right? That when we die, we are reincarnated. And then there's this idea that from reincarnation, we want to seek liberation. Like the goal of life is to break free of this cycle of birth and death and rebirth. And so how we attain that liberation, it depends on the religion, but a lot of it would be certain spiritual practices and rituals, a lot of meditation to detach from this physical world. And so that would be kind of a Indian like subset of religions.
Yeah, great. So another category would be Eastern
Hmm.
religions. And some of these, they're kind of somewhere in between a religion and a
Yes.
philosophy.
Yes.
Taoism, which
Yeah.
is very common in China, would be an example. Confucianism,
Yeah.
which is also a Chinese religion or philosophy. Shinto in
Yeah.
Japan. And then also, just kind of generally speaking, like some of the folk religions
Yeah.
in that part of the world. These religions would emphasize harmony,
Yeah.
harmony within your family, harmony within your society, harmony with your
Yeah.
ancestors. And generally speaking, these religions seek to live in accordance with the natural order of things,
Yeah. Yeah.
just balance in the universe.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, I think a fourth category that we would, kind of carve out here would also be indigenous or traditional religions. And so we could think of like Native American traditional religion or African traditional religion. We could think of like in Australia, Aboriginal like traditional religion. And it's interesting, even though those are widespread throughout the world and very ancient, they do hold some things very much in common. And so, one of those would be a respect or even a worship of ancestors, this belief that those who have gone before us are still present and active and have influence over my life. And so I worship the ancestors so they will have favor on me and help me. A lot of emphasis on specific places that become sacred. It could be a tree or a hill or another location that takes on special spiritual significance. And then there's this like idea of similar to the Eastern religions, but this harmony with nature and the order of creation around them, that there's this harmony sought, this balance sought between their lives, nature, and frequently the spirits and the ancestors. So,
yeah, awesome.
so those are
Great.
like I think four big categories
Yeah.
of religions that we can see.
Yeah, I mean, there are probably as many belief systems around the world as there are
Yeah.
societies around the world, but
Yeah.
generally they can kind of be
There's
broken
some
down. into
Yeah,
those
there's some
categories.
commonalities, but yet saying there's commonalities also acknowledges that there's lots of differences.
Yeah,
in that.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Studying religion is it's kind of big.
Yeah.
It's kind of, different paths you can take, and it can be kind of confusing.
Yeah.
But those four broad categories. So,
Yeah.
Jeff, let's talk a little bit about why this is important.
Yeah, I think it's important. I mean, like obviously religion shapes people's identities, right? Like our identity is very much wrapped around what we believe about the nature of the world, right? And religion speaks into that space of what we believe about the nature of the world. And so I think it's important for a couple of reasons. I mean, number one, if we look at our socio-political world, a lot of global conflicts and like they're shaped by religion. I mean, think of the Middle East as an example, right? An example of many, right? That's probably one of the most prominent, especially right now. But that's a story that's told throughout the world of conflict that comes because of religious differences, because we find our identity in that space. But I think beyond just like a global political realm, I think also like, man, I think if we care about people, we should care about religion,
Yeah.
right? Like I drive, here to the church campus, and I'll see someone who's a Sikh walking down the street frequently, or people of other faiths that I encounter in a supermarket,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And so, like, if I care about people, like I should care about what other people believe,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And so I think there's an importance for us to understand the world we live in, right?
Yeah. Adding to that, like it's a global issue, but it's also a local issue.
For sure.
As
Yeah.
we discussed on the immigration podcast last week, approximately 17% of Avon schools, which, this is thousands of students
Yeah.
because they have like 11,000 students in Avon. These are students that speak English as a second language.
Yeah.
So many of these students practice other religions, and yeah, it's an issue in our community.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that makes it important for us, I would say.
Yeah. I also think, like it's important for us to think about religion because it also shapes our understanding of the nature of the world, right? So like we mentioned that religion can bring about conflict, right? We see that in many parts of the world, and maybe even in some local contexts. But there can also be this cultural undercurrent that, well, aren't religions all this kind of the same, right? And we could ask this question, right? Are all religions fundamentally the same, but only superficially different, right? Goldie Hawn, actress from way back in the day, I mean, she once said, I was born Jewish and I consider that my religion, but I've studied all religions. And as I learn more, I realize that everyone is praying to the same God. And so there's this cultural undercurrent of either conflict that religion brings, or another cultural undercurrent could be, well, aren't we all the same,
Yeah.
right? And I think there's like, is that true, right? Like, is that true? Because I think if we pull that apart, that we're fundamentally the same and only superficially different. Well, the truth claims of the four categories of religions we just talked about are vastly different, right?
Well, and it's even like talking about how complex
Oh.
the study of religion is. And
For
I think
sure.
that's partially because of how different they are.
For sure. Yeah, absolutely. Right. I mean, so if we think of the truth claims, like if we think about the truth claims about like the nature of God, right? Vastly different truth claims between the Abrahamic tradition. And even within that, there's wildly various understandings of who God is. And then you look at Hinduism, Hinduism would say there are thousands of gods, if not more, right? And so like those are vastly different truth claims. And so this idea that we're all praying to the same God is like, well, I don't think that's a fair assessment. And I think if you came to anyone who was like devoutly religious, whatever religion, and you said, oh, you're pretty much the same as anyone else and their faith, I think it's a little bit offensive, right? To say like that your religion is the same as something like just wildly different in belief. And so I think we would land at a place rather than saying that they are fundamentally the same and only superficially different. I think we would flip that, right? And I think we would say that the world's religions are superficially similar, but fundamentally different, I think is where we would land on that.
Yeah. You know, to add to that, I think there's a great example between what Christians and Muslims believe.
Yeah.
So we consider ourselves children of Abraham. And often I get asked the question, you know, by Christians and sometimes even by Muslims, hey, do you think we worship the same God? And my answer is yes and no.
Sure.
I would say historically, yes, we do worship the same God. You know, we all worship the God of Abraham. That's where our history leads us. But theologically, the answer is no.
Yeah.
You know, in Christianity, we believe that our God is triune, you know, 3 in 1, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, one God that exists eternally in 3 different persons. But in Islam, they're Unitarian. They just have the one God.
Right.
And also the nature of things that we believe about Jesus. You know, we would say that Jesus is God, where Muslims would say that Jesus is only a prophet. And so there are some similarities, but if you really drill down to the core of it, you know, those claims lead to some very big differences.
Absolutely. Yeah, for sure.
So Jeff, as Christians, really what we believe about the world and everything in it, and I would say that includes other religions, should be based on what the Bible teaches.
Yeah, absolutely.
So what would you say the Bible teaches about other religions? And I think we can also talk a little bit about how we should interact with other religions as well.
Yeah, I think when we look at the Old Testament, I mean, the first commandment, right, of the 10 Commandments is have no other gods before me, right? This acknowledgement that other religions do exist, but there is one true religion, right? And so this calling to worship the one true God. And I think we do see in the Old Testament a tension. I think with the ancient Israelites, there's this instruction to them to separate themselves from the culture around them and to distinguish themselves from other religions. And so, right, Deuteronomy 7, I think of, that tells them to destroy the idols of the other religions. It tells them to separate themselves from pagan nations. It tells them don't intermarry with people of other faiths, even other, I think, lineages. You know, there's dietary laws that kind of lead to more separation and somewhat isolation. But at the same time, we see this instruction towards separation, but we also see this instruction to reach out. I think of the story of Jonah, right, where God tells Jonah, hey, go to the Ninevites, and they are a pagan nation, right, and talk to them about the one true God. And so there's this tension of separation, but also this engagement and reaching out to people of other faiths that I think we see in the Old Testament.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, moving into the New Testament, that separation is kind of rolled back.
Yeah.
You know, that was a command for the people of ancient Israel, you know, those people of God. But in the New Testament, for the new people of God, there's a lot more engagement of people with other faiths. So one of the first stories that comes to mind for me would be the story of the Apostle Peter and Cornelius, the Roman centurion in Acts 10. You were talking about the dietary laws.
The separation.
That, separated the Jews from other peoples. Well, God appears to Peter in a dream, I think in Acts 9, and says, get up, Peter, kill and eat. Like, I've made all these things clean.
Yes.
And Peter's like, well, I've never eaten anything unclean. And God's like, no, go ahead and do it. And then in Acts 10, the very next chapter, Cornelius, a Roman centurion who may have been God-fearing, but probably was also involved in some pagan religions and, was not originally a Jew, he reached out to Peter, and Peter ended up baptizing his whole family. Later in Acts 15, the early church, the council in Jerusalem, they have this argument over circumcision, which would be another one of the ways that the Jewish people was supposed to separate themselves from other people and other faiths. Basically, the argument is, okay, Jews had to be circumcised. Well, do Christians have to be circumcised? And Peter stands up and he says, hey, it's my judgment that we shouldn't make it difficult for the Gentiles that are turning to God. Yeah. So in Judaism, we had to do this thing to be separate, but that's really not what Jesus has asked us to do. And because of that, we want to make it easier for people of other faiths and other religions to follow the one true God.
And if I remember correctly, it also says, and it seemed to us that the Holy Spirit was also affirming this. So it wasn't just their opinion, but affirmed by the Holy Spirit at the same time. Yeah.
We're talking a lot about Peter, but in 1 Peter 2:17, which, is a book that he wrote, he says, honor everyone, love the family of believers, fear God, and honor the emperor. In the ancient world, the emperor was like the Pope of the pagan religions.
Even worshipped, right?
Yeah, exactly. Worshipped as a god. Yeah. So, I don't think this by any means is saying worship the emperor, but it is saying honor the emperor. We need to give him the respect that he deserves. And I think that's a strong message about how Christians should interact with people of other faiths. Yeah. We need to honor them.
Yeah. I also think of, throughout both the Old Testament and the New Testament, right? We see there's an acknowledgement of a spiritual reality in the world around us, right? That is frequently unseen. In the Old Testament, there are times where, it portrays idols as totally empty, right? So Psalm 115, it says that idols are simply things made by human hands, right? These objects made by human hands. They can't see, they can't hear. I mean, they're hollow and empty. I think of in 1 Kings 18 where Elijah is taunting the prophets of Baal, and he says maybe he's sleeping, and I think even one translation is maybe he's using the bathroom or he went on a journey. You need to wake him up, right? And it's kind of basically saying he's not there, right? It's kind of diminishing any kind of authority or power in those things. But at the same time, there are places where it points to spiritual influences within other religions. Deuteronomy 32, it talks about the Israelites, and when they wandered away from God, it says that they sacrificed to demons, right? Not to God, but to these gods that they don't know and had never known. And that's reinforced in Psalm 106, where it basically says the Israelites served idols, right? And so there's this tension we see in the Old Testament of not giving any power to idols, but also there are moments where it gives some spiritual influence over idols as well. And I think Paul echoes this as well in 1 Corinthians. And so in chapter 8, he kind of echoes some of those thoughts from the Old Testament. He says that an idol is nothing at all, right? It's hollow and empty. But then in chapter 10, he says sacrifices of pagans were offered to demons. And so there's this tension. And I think we want to tread cautiously here. We don't want to under spiritualize, right? What might be happening in other faiths, but we also don't want to over spiritualize it. And so there's this tension I think we see both in the Old Testament and the New Testament of not giving those things power, but also acknowledging some spiritual movements within some of those faiths. So there's a tension in that I think we want to walk cautiously as we move forward on that. I think one thing we would say is that I don't think we see in Scripture of the Bible portraying people of other faiths as the enemy, right?
Yeah,
and so it might portray the other faith as maybe somewhat the enemy, but it doesn't portray that towards people.
Or not the enemy, but necessarily something to be cautious of. Something that you don't want to worship or honor. You need to focus totally on
kind of why
the one true God.
He told the ancient Israelites to separate themselves, right? To not be influenced by that. But it doesn't portray the people of those faiths as the enemy in any sense.
Absolutely. Yeah. So Jeff, the specific question for today that we need to talk about is, how is Christianity different from other religions? And you and Brad did a podcast a few weeks ago about how Jesus is the only way.
Yeah.
I think you may have hit on some of that
Sure.
then, but for our conversation today, what are some key ways
Yeah.
that you would say Christianity is different from other religions?
Yeah, I think there's a lot that we could develop here. I think just for sake of time and just our focus here, I think four things come to mind. The first one would be that salvation is God's initiative, right? Most religions have some sense of like a spiritual path towards enlightenment or liberation or divine favor, right? Christianity teaches this unique way that we are utterly helpless in this whole project, like that there's nothing we can do on our own to restore our spiritual path, right? That it is God's initiative and it requires God taking that step towards us, that we cannot, because of our brokenness, because of our sin, we cannot take a step towards God without his grace and his mercy. And I think that is unique, right? That God is the one who initiates it rather than us. Ephesians 2:8-9, it says, right, for it is by grace you have been saved through faith, not by works, so that no one can boast. And so I think that other religions might emphasize divine grace and mercy. Christianity places this extraordinary emphasis on salvation as this undeserved gift that God gives us.
Yeah, I think one thing I would add to that is, in Christianity, talking about good works, we do good works because we are saved.
Yes.
Like we believe that God is the one who saved us. There's nothing we can do to gain that.
Absolutely.
So we do good works because we are saved. But in many other religions, I think you see the opposite, where they do good works to be saved.
Absolutely.
Maybe in some of like the Indian traditions that we talked about earlier, they're doing good works because they want to gain good karma, which helps them gain a greater place when they're reincarnated.
Yeah.
Or, other religions where good works would lead to heaven, something like that.
Yeah. I think a second uniqueness of Christianity is the idea of the incarnation, right? The incarnation being this central claim in Christianity that God became human in the person of Jesus Christ, and that, that in Jesus, God became fully human, but yet still fully God. And this differs significantly from other religions. Other religions have this idea of maybe the divine taking on human form, but not becoming human. So I think of like in Hinduism, avatars, right? And an avatar in Hindu thought would be one of the gods taking on human form, but they're just taking on the form of humanity. They're not actually taking on the brokenness and weakness of humanity. And the incarnation is actually saying God humbled himself and took on not only the form of humanity, took humanity itself upon himself. And so I think that's really, really unique among the world's religions, that God enters into human suffering and history personally. And I think related to that, I think another unique aspect of Christianity is that the cross is at the center. Right? Many religions have stories of founders who teach and receive revelation. But Christianity is unique in that essentially the founder, right? If we look at Jesus as the founder of our faith, I think it goes back before Jesus, but that Jesus is this founder.
He's the pivotal moment.
Yes, the pivotal moment of our faith in salvation history is his execution, right? And so that the cross is the center is, I think, really unique. We don't view the cross, as Christians, we don't view the cross as this moment of tragedy, right? We'd rather see it as this moment of victory, right? Where sin and death are defeated once and forevermore because of what Jesus did. And, Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15, like, if Christ had not died and been raised again, like our faith is empty, right? And so the cross is at the center. And I think the sacrificial death of Jesus is unique among world religions. And then the last one I say would be like a relational understanding of God. I mean, you mentioned this earlier, like about the nature of the triune God, right? Which I think is also unique, right? That in God himself, that there are three persons, that God is inherently communal, right? Three persons in one, which is a hard concept for us to fully understand.
But also a very beautiful concept.
Beautiful concept and central to our faith, right? And so inherently, right, in God is communal. And that God then extends this invitation into personal relationship to us, right? And I think there's something incredibly beautiful and unique, right, in that. Even that, like the New Testament referring to like God calls us friends,
Yeah.
right? Like that is, I think, really unique among the world's religions. And so this idea that God himself is inherently relational, and then he invites us into relationship is really unique.
Yeah. I love the song, as the deer panteth for the water.
Yeah,
What's the name of that song?
I don't
Like
even-
as the deer or something like that. But
It's
there's
old school.
there's the line in there that says, I'm your friend and you're my brother, even though you are a king.
Yeah.
And I think that expresses that tension in a really, really beautiful way.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Well, I just think, we've kind of talked about some of the uniqueness of Christianity and some of the beliefs of other faiths. I think a central question, Riley, is like, what does that mean for us, right?
Yeah.
Like, what are we supposed to do with any of that? Like, is this just information, or is there some sort of application for us as Christians?
Yeah, well, I mean, there's definitely application. I think it is good information. I think this is information that can build our faith. But also, I think the application is, we have all these people in our world and even in our community. So how do we interact with them?
I mean, some of our listeners would work alongside people of other faiths, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, or go to school with them. So how should we, as believers in Jesus, interact with people of other faiths? I think there's 4 key options. One would be we can withdraw from them. We can separate ourselves from them. I do not think that's in line with the teachings of Jesus and his ministry. Another option is we can look down on them. Once again, I don't think that's what Jesus would teach us. Yeah. Another option is we can go along with them. And I think going along with other religions would be saying like, well, all religions are basically the same.
Kind of like we talked about.
Kind of like what we talked about earlier.
Yeah.
Exactly. We don't think that's the correct response. So the correct response as a follower of Jesus is we can engage people of other faiths.
Yeah, that's good.
I love the story of Paul in Athens in Acts 17. So he's there and he sees this, all these statues of gods. And what he says is, people of Athens, I see that you are very religious. Yeah. He didn't say, why are you worshiping all these idols?
Yeah, he compliments them, right?
Exactly, he compliments you. You are very religious. Yeah. And, there are devout followers of other religions that I believe are worthy of honor and respect. I think of my Muslim friends. I see during Ramadan, the way that they fast and pray and devote themselves to following God in the way that they understand it. And I think that's worthy of honor. I commend that. But then the next thing that Paul says is he says, you are ignorant of the very thing that you worship. And that's what I'm going to proclaim to you. So Paul, he honors them, but he also tells people who God truly is. And as believers, I believe that we need to always be prepared to share what we believe with others, to share what we believe is true. That's part of a healthy way to engage a person from another religion.
Well, I think it's also helpful for us to remember that, with Paul in the early church, I mean, you're talking about an incredibly religiously diverse society. I mean, maybe one of the most religiously diverse societies in history, right? Where you had...
And Christianity was the minority.
Totally. And illegal initially, right? And persecuted. And so you had like people worshiping Greco-Roman gods. You had emperor worship where people would worship the emperor. You had other idol worship and like these kind of mystery cults and religions. Judaism was right there. And so like in the midst of this incredibly religiously diverse society, we don't see Christians in the early church hiding or isolating themselves. But what do? They engaged. And so I think that's really convicting and telling, right? That we see Paul and the early church engaging with these religions. I don't think they compromised, right? I don't think they we're going to just kind of also agree with these things. They drew like, this is who we are. This is like, we are centered on Jesus. And they engaged with the world around them, I think with compassion and conviction and neighborly love. And I think that the early church really took seriously Matthew 28 when Jesus says, what is our command, right? Jesus says, I've given you all authority, right? And go and make disciples of every nation and every people group and every religious orientation, all of that, right? And that the Holy Spirit will be with us, right? And that the early church took that seriously. And so I think that, they engaged.
Yeah.
I also think like what comes to mind too is even the birth of world religions as an academic study finds its roots in the 16th century with Jesuit missionaries. And these Jesuit missionaries, as they went out and they encountered people of other faiths, they kind of came back and like, we need to understand this more. Why? So we can engage effectively with them. And so as these Jesuits encountered like Hinduism in India, they're like, man, we want to understand this. And so that kind of started the academic study of other faiths, was this desire for Christians to engage with people of other religions.
Yeah, I think that's awesome. So, talking specifically about how we engage, I want to say what we don't do.
Yes.
And then I want to give some practical ideas for what we do.
Yeah.
So I would say what we don't do is we don't attack people of other faiths.
Yep.
The New Testament cautions people against cautions Christians specifically against practicing other faiths. Like you talked about in 1 Corinthians 8-10 earlier. But also, we don't ever see Jesus or Paul attacking another faith, or especially a person from another faith. And something that I want to bring up because it's timely is our Lieutenant Governor, Micah Beckwith. He recently called Islam a demonic death cult.
Yeah.
And I believe that Muslims are a group that is often vilified in our society. Since 9/11 or, the end of the war in Afghanistan, now there's a lot of political issues surrounding Muslims. And I really believe that attacking this specific group of people is not in line with the teachings of the New Testament.
Yeah. Even what we see with Paul, right? In Athens, what does he say? He doesn't come in and say, oh, you're worshiping a bunch of death cults, right? He said, I see you're religious. Let's talk about religion and faith and spirituality.
Yeah. So as far as what we do,
Yeah.
I would say the first thing is just build relationships with people of other religions.
Yeah.
If you have a coworker, a classmate, I would encourage you, just to talk to that person.
Yeah.
Don't be weird about it, but you shouldn't be afraid to talk to some of these people. And I actually think that, my faith has even been strengthened by some of these relationships, and I've learned a lot, and I've enjoyed getting to learn new things.
Yeah.
I don't think that people should ever be afraid of learning about other faiths.
Yeah. I think too, one of the ways you can engage, like if you work with someone of another religion, I think there's this desire for people of many faiths to get to know people, right? And so like if you like invite someone to lunch, right? Just go to lunch with someone, get to know them. Not so that you can debate them, but like just to get to know them, hear their story. I will say that given other cultural contexts, like the way you go about doing that might need to be different.
Yeah.
I think of the story that we both have read the same book, right? Where I forget what cultures they were from, but it was an American couple ladies who had a coworker who was from another country, maybe another faith, and they asked her to go to lunch, and she said no. And so these two ladies that were Americans just thought, well, she doesn't want to get to know us, and so they went to lunch on their own. The lady from this other culture, in their culture, you never say yes the first time of invitation. It's rude. And so you say no, and then if they ask again, then you can say yes. And so this lady is thinking, they don't want to get to know me because they only asked me once. And so there's this like transition or translation problem with their cultural understanding. And so if you work with someone and you want to get to know them, just know that sometimes there can be some we can lose some things in translation.
Sure.
And so ask multiple times, because sometimes cultures need multiple invitations before they can say yes.
There are definitely cross-cultural dynamics at play.
Yeah. But invite someone to lunch, right? And just kind of get to know somebody from another faith.
I would add, that prayer is so important.
Absolutely.
Pray for people of other religions, especially if you know people personally.
Yep.
And also, if you're listening to this podcast and you're struggling with some of this, maybe you perceive, people of other religions or other religions as the enemy or something that we should be afraid of, or maybe even something that we should hate. I would just encourage you to pray that God would soften your heart.
Yeah, absolutely.
And also with that, to open doors for you to meet people from other faiths.
I think, to some extent, like there has been, you mentioned this, but such a stereotypical view of Muslims, right? And so some of us have developed a hardness of heart towards people of the Muslim faith, right? And like maybe, like you said, just pray that God would soften your heart towards those people, I think is really, really important.
Yeah. So, Jeff, what do you have to say before we close?
A couple things come to mind just as we close, right? I think of both Peter and Paul, right, in the New Testament, and they give this instruction to us. So in 1 Peter 3:15, he writes, like, for us to always be ready to give an answer for the hope that we have, right? That we should always be prepared as Christians. If people said, like, why are you so hopeful? Like, why do you have peace? We should be ready to answer that question. But he gives us some instructions of how to do that. And Peter says, but always do that with gentleness and respect. And that idea of gentleness then is echoed when Paul writes to Timothy in 2 Timothy 2. He says that, like, a Lord's servant must not be quarrelsome, but kind to everyone, able to teach, patiently enduring evil. And then it says, correcting his opponents with gentleness. And I remember a book by Dallas Willard, one of my favorite authors, and he wrote a book on apologetics. And Riley, you would know well the apologetics world. And the apologetics world can frequently be combative, right? Like that I am trying to win an argument. And Willard titled his book, The Allure of Gentleness, echoing what Peter said and echoing what Paul said, that we enter into our interactions with other people with gentleness, and that there is an allure to being gentle and gracious towards people. And Willard's whole point was that if we want to give an apologetic towards people, which apologetic just means to give a rational defense of the Christian faith, if we want to do that well, like, we need to do that with gentleness. And I think that applies to a lot of these conversations that we're having in this podcast. Like, are we able to do those things and interact with people with gentleness? Because there is an allure to gentleness that a lot of people don't see in the world. So I would land there. Like, how can we be more gentle as Christians towards those that are different than us?
Yeah, I think that's a good word.
Yeah.
Jeff, I really appreciate you coming on today. Thanks for lending your expertise
great,
to
Riley.
this. And I just want to thank you all for listening or watching, and we hope you'll join us for the episode next week.